Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating and honestly, a pretty wild case study in leadership. We're going to use a specific psychological lens from our source material to explore what happens when someone's inner doubt gets projected outward as a very, very loud public performance. So, this is where it all starts. This is our central puzzle. That quote you see, it's from Tennessee's top financial watchdog, Jason Mumpower. It is an extreme, absolute statement. But here's the truly stunning part. He said it about an audit that was only 25% complete. So you have to ask, why? What is going on here? I mean, what could possibly drive a public official to make a declaration that huge, that sweeping on such little data? Well, the source material we're looking at proposes a really compelling psychological framework to decode this exact type of behavior. Let's get into it. Okay, so here's the big idea. The source suggests we look at all of this through the lens of imposter syndrome. It's a theory that basically connects a deep internal fear to a very specific set of external, almost performative actions. Now let's be super clear about what this is. It's all about the feeling of being a fraud. It's that persistent little voice in the back of your head that says, you don't belong here. Any minute now, they're gonna find you out. It's this private anxiety that, according to the theory, can trigger a very public and loud response. And here's how that cycle works. It starts with this perceived gap in your own abilities. You feel like you're not good enough. That feeling creates a constant, nagging fear of being exposed. And to fight that fear, you overcompensate. You act bigger, louder, more certain than you actually feel, creating this kind of compensatory theater to hide all that inner doubt. So, let's bring this theory back to our case study. According to the source, that first step in the cycle, that perceived inadequacy, has a very clear origin point here. It's what the text calls the core qualification gap. I mean, just look at this. The contrast is so stark. On the one hand, you have Mumpower's predecessors in this role, Tennessee's top auditor. They've got elite law degrees, CPA credentials, deep careers in finance. Then, on the other hand, you have Mumpower. His background? Public relations and marketing. He doesn't have an accounting degree. He's not a CPA. The source literally calls this a textbook setup for imposter syndrome, being put in a role where your own qualifications just don't stack up against the job's requirements. So this textbook setup, this deep qualification gap, that's the engine driving the anxiety. And according to our source, that anxiety shows up in 5 distinct repeating patterns of behavior. It argues these patterns are a direct result of overcompensation. Let's walk through them, one by one. Okay, pattern number 1 is dominance. This is when someone projects this exaggerated confidence, this absolute authority to try and silence that inner voice of doubt. It's all about performing authority loudly because you don't have the quiet confidence to just do the job. And you can see the evidence right there in the language. I mean, these are not the measured, careful words of a typical auditor. A pile of sinking sand, made out like a bandit. This is theatrical. It's over the top. The source argues these are the words of someone performing the role, not just doing it. Pattern number 2, attention-seeking. The thinking here is pretty simple. If you can't generate confidence from the inside, you start desperately seeking validation from the outside. You turn your job into a public spectacle to get that applause from the crowd. You know, an auditor's work is normally pretty quiet, right? Administrative, behind the scenes. But here, we see this pattern of grandstanding, mailing over 1,000 letters directly to residents and act his own office called unprecedented, holding that big press conference for an incomplete audit. These actions aren't actually required by the job. They're choices that consistently put a spotlight on the performance. All right, let's get to the third pattern, aggression. This is a classic ego defense mechanism. When you feel overwhelmed and anxious inside, you displace that anxiety by lashing out at other people. You go on the attack. And look, this isn't just an interpretation. This is based on direct testimony. 15 state lawmakers actually signed a letter using these exact words, aggressive, unprofessional, inappropriate, to describe his conduct. So instead of being a partner in financial oversight, the approach was repeatedly seen as combative. Okay, this next pattern, this one is maybe the most psychologically revealing, according to the source. It's all about who becomes the target of that aggression. The theory suggests that someone who is terrified of being exposed will avoid confronting powerful people who could actually expose them. Instead, they punch down. The source observes this really uncomfortable consistency in the targets of Mumpower's most theatrical and aggressive attacks. They often seem to be smaller, less resourced institutions, many with majority Black populations. The analysis suggests these targets weren't chosen because they posed the greatest financial risk to the state, but because they offered the least resistance and the biggest stage to perform authority on. And the final pattern is a bit of a paradox: rushing to judgment. You'd think an expert would be cautious, but someone who feels insecure often can't stand the anxiety of not knowing. So they rush to a bold, definitive conclusion just to feel a sense of control. And that brings us right back to the number that started this whole thing: declaring an organization the worst managed he'd ever seen based on only a quarter of the evidence. It's the need for a loud, public verdict completely overriding the patient, thorough work that the job actually requires. So let's put it all together. The source takes these 5 patterns we just talked about and assembles them into a clear, step-by-step formula that explains how you get from a simple qualification gap to full-blown compensatory theater. And here it is, the formula. It all starts with being unqualified for the role. That creates chronic anxiety and a threatened ego. This, in turn, leads to a loud, aggressive public performance. But that performance needs a target, and a vulnerable one is chosen. And the end result of all of this? A total focus on spectacle over actual substance. You can draw a direct line from the inner fear to the outer performance. So the really crucial takeaway here is this: what might look like bold, decisive leadership from the outside is, when you look at it through this lens, something else entirely. It's the performance of authority by someone who fears they don't actually have it. And the great irony, of course, is that the performance itself ends up destroying the very credibility it was designed to create. Which leaves us with a final, much broader question to think about. When we look at any leader, in politics, in business, anywhere, how can we learn to spot the difference? How do we distinguish the quiet competence that comes from true confidence from the loud spectacle of someone who's just performing it?